All right, Zach, welcome to the channel. Thanks for coming on. I'm really excited to have you.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So I normally don't have recruiters on. I think you were the first one. I have had many requests over the years, but I've given it. I thought you'd be a great guest just because we have had some good interactions. So I followed you on LinkedIn for a while. I saw you doing like your bar meetups and your events. And then I've kind of also had you come to the Quant conference. You showed up to that. We chatted with that in person. Um,
Yep.
you had actually good insight, which
I
I didn't always
appreciate that.
get.
It's a shame that that's a rarity for a recruiter, but I'll take it.
Yeah. So why don't you walk me through like how did you even get into recruiting? It's one of those jobs I always feel like it's something where a lot of people start in a career like you're doing the job and then people seem to drift away. Did you do that or did you just kind of dive right into recruiting?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting one. I didn't grow up telling my parents I wanted to be a recruiter. For most kids, it's lawyer, doctor, pilot. Ironically, one of my brothers is a commercial airline pilot, and another is actually running business development and talent acquisition for a global quant analytics shop in the UK, but they have offices across Europe and the US. But it was very much something that I stumbled into as a 21-year-old graduate. I didn't actually know anything about recruitment, what it entailed outside of the very basic concept of I suppose, placing someone from one job into another, which unfortunately a lot of people believe is all we do, which I'm sure we'll get to later on. But I was requested for an interview, the only interview I took at the time, actually, with a large London-based agency. I had less than 24 hours to prepare for the interview, so it was very, very much so a crash course. And to sort of try my best to prep for that. I was considering other options at the time, but really was sold the dream when I went in for the interview. I unironically sold the dream by very, very good salespeople, um, and ended up accepting their offer. So, I suppose I'll not be self-righteous here and say that I took the job with the sole purpose of helping people at the time. Really, the earning potential was very attractive. And I was told that I could earn X, Y, and Z, and these big numbers they throw at you in my first and second year, much like a quant, ironically, and beyond. And as a 21-year-old, sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, living in the big city of London, which is incredibly expensive, thought that this could be my ticket to financial liberty, while simultaneously being able to change people's lives as well. But growing up in a household with four brothers and everyone jockeying for position at all times, you develop very quickly, I suppose, an inherent and I would say deep sense of competitiveness, which has always served me well, having now spent the last 10 years as a recruiter, as a headhunter. So yeah, I think that sort of recruiting as a whole, I kind of fell into it with no real plan of going into it. It just sort of, I stumbled into the role.
And then how did you get to the US? I know so for me, I was shocked. Everyone I've worked with at your past employer, so Selby Jennings,
Yeah.
always someone British. It's always the accent. I'm like, what is going on with this? It didn't take me, I don't know, probably a couple of years. I finally Googled it. And then I realized it's UK based. I was like, this makes
Yeah.
complete sense. But there's a
Yeah.
lot of them in the US, which I think is always surprising. Someone will call and say, hey, I'm located in New York or Chicago or somewhere. We're doing some recruiting, but it's always like the British accent.
Yeah, there's probably too many of us at this point. No, yeah, I mean, so I suppose maybe there's two parts to this question of getting into quant recruitment specifically in the US market and what brought me here. So I suppose I'll start with what brought me here and then go into the quant side. So I was helping to build a risk and quant analytics recruitment function for a UK-based agency I was with for 6 years before Selby Jennings. And most ambitious recruitment firms in the UK, they view America as a market that you can't really ignore. And they wanted to expand outside of just New York into the South and Midwest, or sort of what I describe as non-traditional financial hubs. It's harder to find talent on a consistent basis outside of New York and LA, right, where it's just a very high saturation of both recruiters and candidates. So lots of banks and financial institutions, as you know, are headquartered in Texas or open satellite offices in Texas and Dallas specifically, actually. And these satellite offices often became a lot larger. And then obviously over time, a lot of these banks said, look, we're going to be effectively HQ'd or second HQ in Dallas. So, you take a JPM, a Goldman Sachs, et cetera. They've built or are in the process of building large campuses here. I think Bank of America are building a 30-story building in Uptown.
Yeah.
Santander renaming the entire Thanksgiving Tower when I moved here in 2018 to now the Santander Tower. These businesses were taking on more real estate. And lots of candidates wanting to move here as well, particularly during COVID. Candidates were actively wanting to get to or get out of those higher cost locations, lifestyle reasons, financial reasons, of course. And so really there was a gap in the market of, I suppose, a need for specialist recruiters in an underserviced geography. And I would say even now, although it's caught up a little bit, the Dallas market is probably 5-10 years behind that of what New York and LA is. And the same way traditional financial hubs such as New York and LA and so on are highly saturated with recruiters, Texas wasn't. And it probably still isn't, to be honest with you. And that boom, I think in many respects is still happening. But other markets too, such as pharma and life sciences, right? It's not just financial services. Obviously, Boeing here and Toyota, and obviously there's the sort of financial services arm of Toyota. So ultimately, I suppose in short, it made a lot of sense from a career standpoint. I often describe America as, in the best way possible, capitalism on steroids. It's a place where the vast majority of the population doesn't feel the pain of a recession as much as, say, a Europe or the UK, where things sort of grind to a halt. And so a lot of headhunters who make the jump across the pond can really accelerate their career path. So that's what brought me here. In terms of, I suppose, the quant recruitment side, I viewed it as being a more glamorous market segment. That kind of falls between sort of true executive search and traditional contingent retained agencies, and that you have graduates and quant researchers, developers, and with a handful of years of experience and top quant trading firms earning more than sometimes industry veterans with 25 years plus experience. I suppose depending on portfolio performance and so on and so forth. And there's recruiters for nearly everything you can think of, from blue collar warehouse workers and lower level office admin staff all the way to placing CEOs. And for me personally, because recruitment in its purest form is very repetitive and a combination of compounding behaviors and actions that you can execute on daily, and a lot of obsession as well, I was very adamant that if I'm spending 12 plus hours a day doing a job, and immersing myself in a market, that I need to have a genuine passion and interest in it, or I'd probably lose my mind.
Yeah.
I suppose the last thing I'll say, just for the purpose of the wider podcast, or the purpose or clarity for your listeners, I should define maybe sort of two buckets of quant analytics that I have experience in. So you've got the trading bucket, really focused on driving P&L growth, and that's going to be traditional buy side and sell side quants. So quant traders, PMs, researchers, financial engineers, developers, so on, pricing quants. You then have, I suppose, decision sciences, such as statistical modelers, model developers, validators, individuals who are more concerned with optimizing the decision-making process and leveraging data, and obviously advanced analytics to support strategic decision-making. And you can see them both as actually completely different markets, but there's lots of crossover in terms of skill set.
So following up on that, do you see people trying to do that crossover? Because I get a lot of recruiters say, "Oh, there's this great opportunity in New York City. It's a trading analyst role, or it's a trader, senior manager or something." It seems like an odd switch, just skill wise and market wise. Like I'm always very skeptical. I don't have the experience in that side of it, so it seems like a weird kind of transition.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose from a candidate perspective, it's probably a bit harder than obviously from a recruitment perspective. I think there's a lot of recruiters that will do the traditional risk and analytics side, but want to be more involved with the true sort of revenue generating quant business. But from a candidate perspective, I'd say it is quite tough, but it does happen. I'd say it happens quite rarely. It really depends. If you're in a sort of more quantitatively aligned market risk front office position, it's probably going to be a little bit easier for you to transition into a more traditional quant role. Typically the banks, and I'm happy to talk about this in a bit more detail later on, but typically the banks, there's a really good path there where, you know, when you're working at an investment bank in a specific segment of the firm, it's not as siloed as, say, some of the hedge funds. And so your experience is broader, and therefore there tends to be more opportunity. With the top hedge funds, the much larger hedge funds, it is very siloed, and therefore it's a lot harder to make that transition because they're looking for, a top 1% of candidate with a very, very specific skill set. Whereas maybe the banks say, well, we've got someone with a PhD from Columbia. Maybe they're doing sort of traditional, they're a sort of, I don't know, they're in CECL or forecasting or, credit risk modeling effectively. But they have a degree in statistics, a PhD in statistics from a top university. There's going to be a lot of theoretical crossover here versus maybe practical crossover, but they can teach that if you have the right sort of level of aptitude, intelligence, and ability. So in short, it's rare, but it does happen and it can happen. What I would say, just to sort of finish my point, is that from a recruitment standpoint, as a headhunter, it's almost unheard of, and it probably won't happen, that you're going to have a recruiter, a headhunter represent you if you're in a sort of second line or a back office sort of analytics role trying to get into a quant role. Because as a recruiter, as a headhunter, we've got a specific mandate from our clients and they are looking for X, Y, and Z. And if you do not have that, you're not going to be represented. So actually, for those who are looking to make that transition, I'd go as far as saying, don't speak to a headhunter.
Yeah, that's probably pretty good advice on that.
Yeah, ironically, I shouldn't say that, but that's probably the truth.
Do you want to talk about on kind of going on that idea here of like, what does a recruiter do? I think a lot of people just assume, right, you just send out a bunch of spam emails and then they just gather resumes and then they place them. But I don't think a
Yeah.
lot of people see, I guess, specifically for me, like I didn't see all the work until you become a manager and you're having to do like market analytics and figure out like the pool of talent and then trying to find candidates and then having issues with like building teams, for example, because you're looking for different dynamics.
Yeah, it's I suppose in what you just said at the start with spamming emails, unfortunately, is somewhat true. What we do, so as I alluded to earlier, our job isn't just placing someone from one job into another. It's a lot more complex than this, and the reason is, on average, there's a 40% attrition rate in a recruitment agency, irrespective of size. That's the average level of attrition within a recruitment agency. So take from that what you will, but it's because it's difficult. And recruitment has, it probably has one of the highest, if not the highest attrition rate of any industry out there. And because there are so many different facets of what makes a good, effective recruiter, marrying up different skill sets to ensure you're supporting your clients and candidates, and offering them the best service possible whilst maintaining a high level of performance, because you have to place people to put food on the table, and that's how we're paid. So in short, in terms of what we do, we're here to source, we're here to screen, we're here to interview and onboard specialist talent. We're here to understand, and I suppose this is what a good recruiter does, is to understand the operational and strategic aims, goals, objectives of our clients, but also understand at a deeper level the candidates' motivations and goals too, and really playing matchmaker. You must remember that even if someone is a good fit on paper and can do the job, and probably to a high level, it does not necessarily lead or mean that they are a good fit for the client, or the role itself. The work often starts also when the candidate starts in the role. I think a lot of, I suppose there is a bit of a misconception here around, what happens, when the candidate's placed. Are we just out there to place and then sort of run off into the sunset and never be heard from again? The work for me, in my opinion, starts when the candidate starts. There's a tremendous amount of reputational risk attached to a candidate leaving within the guarantee or rebate period, or even after this. And so when a client is struggling to fill a position, or it's taking too long to find someone, maybe an internal talent team doesn't have the means or the network, or quite frankly, the time, or there is maybe a genuine impact, a negative impact, whether that be direct or residually affecting the wider team, i.e., a higher workload because you don't have the right staffing levels. It might make sense then to speak to a headhunter who specializes within that specific domain to utilize their network, and go out there and really find the right fit, both technically and culturally, and quickly. So I suppose that's kind of what we do.
And to that point too, I think I didn't view this either very well. I think many people have this negative connotation, which is
Yeah.
recruiters are very expensive.
Mhm.
And so I thought, like, I've even been told that firms, we do not use recruiters, it's so expensive. And then one of the firms is saying I don't know how many millions it was, they're spending every year on recruiters because you get paid a percentage of the salary of the candidates being placed. But then when
Mm.
you start to the actual accounting of this, right, you have a senior and managing director or something, four or $500,000 salary, and they're spending, I don't know, let's say 200 hours to find a candidate. You
Mhm.
start to really conceptualize the recruiter actually is a better value, I think, than a lot of people realize. Because now you're taking a managing director away that's having to do the hiring. Maybe you're taking staff, vice presidents, even analysts, all their time, and you start aggregating the entire firm's time. And I think for me, that's where I started realizing, like, oh, I'm running out of time. I don't have the time to do recruiting. It makes sense to find a good recruiter that has that expertise to really do all those interviews and the calls and the filtering and gets kind of a good candidate in front of you instead of spending, oh, gone through hundreds of resumes. I've gone through volleyball coaches. I've gone through um I think we had like someone that just was like a college dropout, applying for a quant job with minimum requirement, master's, PhD.
Right.
It's nice to have someone to pre-filter all that just because the amount of time it actually takes to go through all of that process.
100%. And on that point, because I think there are lots of misconceptions about recruiters. There are lots of I mean, yeah, you're right, that there is a stigma attached to any sales role. And there's
Mhm.
different types of sales, right? When I go and buy a car, I don't always feel too great about, there are certainly some prejudices attached to me going in the room and being approached by someone, and I know they're trying to get a deal done and make some cash, right?
Yeah.
It's obviously in its most basic form, supply and demand. But to your point around cost and such, um, I am a firm believer in life that you get what you pay for. I really do believe that. And this misconception of recruiters are expensive and unnecessary, um, you know, while recruitment services do come at a cost, to your exact point, they save businesses time and money in the long run.
Mhm.
And finding the right candidates efficiently and ultimately reducing turnover, right? That's the view here. Because if you don't have someone in a role, as I just said, there is a residual effect that will have on the team. Um, Recruiters obviously have access to a much broader network of candidates and very industry specific expertise. And so, I think I often do lots of counteroffer preparation to candidates, because counteroffers are almost policy, because it's a business decision, but it costs something like 1.5 times that person's salary to replace them. There's a loss of intellectual property. There's, as I said, the residual. There's how it affects the wider business. There's a lot of things that come into play there, and so you know really you want to get that person in sooner rather than later. And I think as well with lots of clients, it's also maybe understanding, you know, what does good look like? And what I mean by that is, I had a conversation with a client the other day and they said, look, this role's been open for 4 months. And I said, okay, well, how do you feel about that? That's fine. That's pretty normal for us. And I'm sat there in shock, right? So I'm sat there thinking, I mean, that's outrageous, because that's 4 months. You're sort of pushing on nearly half a year. And by the time you do hire someone, it probably is going to be half a year that you don't have someone in that role. And this is a team lead opportunity. So you think of I suppose the productivity you can get from having that person in that role, or actually in this case, the loss of productivity.
Mhm.
If you were just spoken to a specialist recruiter who can find you 5 very good resumes within 24 to 48 hours, get the role filled in on average 4 to 6 weeks, I mean, surely that makes a lot more sense. And then
Yeah.
there was the issue of people in that team who are unhappy, and once somebody is unhappy, it's actually very hard to pull them back, right? And so, there's an inevitability that of that team of 6 people, you're probably going to lose maybe 1 or 2 of them, right? Where that could have been avoided. So, yeah, I think there are, and I'm happy to go into it, particularly around misconceptions, because I think it is a really important point. But yeah, so that's my take on that.
Yeah, no, let's dive into that. I mean, I've had horrible experiences with recruiters over the years, and then I've had a few diamonds that have come out of it. And kind
Sure.
of to your point, the attrition piece is frustrating because
Mm,
often you'll work with a recruiter and I'm like, okay, I've worked with them, they get me, they understand me, they place me in this great job, and then you contact them like 2 years later, you're like, hey, I'm having a rough go, and they're like, oh, I don't work in the quant space anymore, or I work in HR at a company somewhere else, and you're like I just want to have a long-term relationship where it's like someone you can trust. But at
yeah.
the same time, I think to your point, there's just so many people that dive into this, I think, for that money piece, right? You could make huge salaries, so people pile in, and then it's like they provide garbage service. I get spammed constantly. Anytime a job posting goes up on the internet, I get at least 20, 30 recruiters from all kinds of funds.
Yeah.
Um, Even bad ones. I'll have like someone's like, oh, we're a specialist in like the healthcare industry, but we could help you find someone for your finance position. And I'm like, no.
Yeah, it's head banging stuff, wall banging stuff. No, I totally get that, and you make a good point, right? In any job, there's going to be some bad apples, um, and there are individuals out there that are just more money motivated, right? So you know, that's where it becomes a lot more transactional. Um, and I suppose from a contract recruiter's perspective, if they're just placing contractors, that relationship often is quite transactional, and that's okay because everyone understands that that's the case. That's just the status quo. And so the client, the candidates, the recruiter, they understand that it's going to be maybe a bit more transactional. We need this person quickly. You need to deliver quickly. Get me the right people. I will pay you. Um, on the sort of full-time perm direct hire, whatever you want to call it, it's very different because it needs to be relationship led. Um, and I would say, I suppose part of my job on this conversation is advocating for the world of recruitment. So I'll do that, and I'll run through a couple of misconceptions that I see very often. One is that recruiters only care about filling a position quickly. Again, if you're a contract recruiter, that probably is the main goal. And many people believe that recruiters are solely focused on getting candidates through the door as quickly as possible without regard for quality of the match. The reality is that while speed is very important, and that's something I stand by, it's speed and efficiency that really, the best recruiters can, or I suppose the best performers in recruitment work with speed and efficiency, but they combine that with the relationship side. They combine that with the service they're offering. And so whilst it is important, most recruiters aim to find the best fit for both the candidate and the employer, because they understand that a poor match it's going to lead to higher turnover rates, which is detrimental to both parties. And as I say, I mentioned reputational damage and reputational risk. There is no value in getting paid $100,000 for 3 placements, but 2 of those 3 placements drop out because you haven't done your job correctly, and there's no post-placement care process, and there's no real relationship building with the candidate. And so one thing I'm really big on is before I place a candidate, I'll always meet with them. Right? That's incredibly important that I see the whites of their eyes, whether it be over a beer or a coffee, because you really get to know people better. And
Mhm.
that's so important. So I think that's one misconception of we're just here to fill positions quickly because we want to pick up a paycheck. I suppose another one is, a lot of people think we only work for the client, we only work for the employer, right, and not for the candidate, because ultimately they're paying us, right? So, how does that work? We're not just looking out for the interest of an employer, again, for the aforementioned reasons, but a successful recruiter, a good recruiter, works as a mediator, and they're balancing the needs again of both parties. And really our goal is to create, as I say, that mutually beneficial arrangement. It's a win-win for everyone involved, right? And so, there are some recruiters that might sort of look at, human capital and candidates as our sort of currency, if you will,
Mhm.
right? Because we're not trading stocks and such, we're dealing in people. There is a reality that human beings are incredibly volatile creatures. And you can have a candidate telling you the whole time they love the job, they love the role, they're happy to relocate, their husband, their wife, their partner is happy, so on, and then they get an offer and they pull out last minute because they just decide not to, right? It's
Yeah.
it's an incredibly difficult process. And so it's a very emotionally driven one as well, because it is a life event. And so for me, it's that relationship piece is so incredibly important. Um, Another couple that recruiters, a lot of people think that recruiters have the final say in hiring decisions. Untrue. We're facilitating that hiring process. You have the final say. That rests with the hiring manager and the client, not us. We also can't guarantee the job. Part of our job is to ensure that we are preparing candidates sufficiently, thoroughly, making sure that we can give them the competitive edge, because it's obviously in our best interest, right? We don't have to be self-righteous about this because there is money involved. So, we're going to help guide them through that hiring process, but we can't guarantee the job. Uh, Another one is recruitment. Recruitment is just about finding candidates. That is so untrue. And I mentioned it earlier, but it is such a comprehensive and complex process, because we're understanding and we're balancing the needs of lots of different people, and not just yourself as a hiring manager, not just the candidate or an applicant, but their families as well, right? Because it does have an effect on, if you are relocating, if you have kids in school, if you have a partner that's got a job somewhere, or, it really does change lives. And so, there's so much more to it than meets the eye. It's there's a psychological aspect to it, there's a sociological aspect to it,
I think
and so on.
the salary part for me has always been great. I always
Mm,
hate doing the negotiations with companies. I always feel like they're really on edge. But whenever there's a recruiter in the middle, I feel like it's this nice buffer of like, I can tell you a number. And then it's
yeah.
like, you're like, a representative. So you can say, hey, I already talked to the company. They're looking for this range. If you came down, 5% or something, you'd be right in their range. I always feel like
Mm.
that is a great benefit I've had with working with recruiters versus like I always feel awkward in the company's like, well, how much do you want to make? And I'm like, I mean,
Yeah.
how much are
It's
you
not
willing to
a
pay?
exactly. And it's not an easy conversation, right? It
No, it's
never is.
not.
And it's not for you, right? Even for yourself, if you're going direct and you're having to have that conversation, often what you'll do is say, HR talent, can you have this conversation? Right? That's what lots of hiring managers do, because they don't want to have that conversation. So no, agreed. And look, for context as well, in case people don't know, um, you know, uh, the way the mechanics of recruitment is, we find a candidate, we have percentage terms of basic salary or total compensation. For quants, sometimes it's future compensation for that year, depending on P&L and so on. But let's say it's a $50,000 fee. Ultimately, when that invoice is paid by the client, the recruiter who placed the candidate would see a portion of that, right? And that would depend on a few factors, but that could be anywhere from, I suppose 20 to 30%, right?
Yeah.
Um, so really what you want to do as a recruiter is you want to stack as many placements into a given month, for various reasons of how commission is paid out. And effectively, the more you invoice, over the course of a month or a quarter, the higher the percentage you get, right? So,
Okay.
um, so for context, it's in our best interest to maximize earning for the candidates we're working with. But the same way as, we're working on behalf of the employer and the candidate, we're not going to get anywhere if we're mismanaging expectations on either side. So as much as we're there to advocate for that, because, again, I suppose it is a misconception that we're a human resource function. We're not. We're not human resources. We're sales. And so, loosely, I would say we're sales. And so, I'm not here to cut costs, right? I'm not here to necessarily manage people to the ground in terms of their comp expectations. What I am here to do is ensure that they're at least getting a level of uptick that is in line with the market, ideally more, right?
Hmm.
I don't care what somebody is making when I have a conversation with them. They don't need to tell me that they're earning 150K. If you're earning 150K and you want 200K, right, a 50K increase, then you had better justify that, and you had better interview exceptionally well for the client to even consider 200K. And there are things such as, how you interview, how you compare to other candidates on the market, how you compare to candidates in the team as well. That's part of your job, is how you manage the politics. You can't bring someone in with the same amount of experience as someone in your team earning 100K and put them on 150. that's going to cause issues. So there's lots of things that go into it. But yes, we're here to maximize that, but we're also here to respect the budget, and that's where the psychological side of it comes in. That's when the sales side comes into it. What are we doing to help and guide and help the candidate realize that this is a genuinely good move for them, and that staying where they are might not be a good move?
So how do you have that conversation with companies? Like, how do you get all this information? Because when I do the hiring, these are the things I think about, right? I have a compensation structure of my team, and I have a value I'm trying to get. I'm also seeing roles where the comp is so low, it's not even industry
Mm,
comparable. Like, how do you do that on the recruiter side, though? Because you are trying to take into consideration, right, the company's current team dynamics,
sure.
industry compensation, industry, competition, and then having that awkward conversation of, hey, you're offering way too little. You're not going to be able to place somebody in that role.
So that's actually something I wanted to talk about, particularly around job postings and requirements, right? But to answer your question, there are unfortunately lots of unrealistic hiring managers um, who aren't aligned to the market, and that might not be their fault, by the way. And that's partly why, as a recruiter, what I mean by we're not just here to fill your role, we're also here, I mean, the actual job title is recruitment consultant. So we're here to consult as well. Um, we are the market experts. We're the people that are speaking to hundreds of clients and candidates every single week. I spend upwards of, 3+ hours a day on the phone, right? And
Mhm.
so all I'm doing is gathering data, right? And by all means, a lot of it is abstract and relative, right? But I'm just gathering data and I'm really painting a picture of what the market is every single day. And so there are some unrealistic hiring managers. And so when I'm reviewing a posting, or if I'm speaking to a client about a role, I'm also looking at the likelihood and my ability to fill that role. And so plenty of times I've turned down clients, right? There are loads of examples, including last week, where I would just say, look, thanks, but no thanks, because I
Yeah.
need to make sure I'm spending my time in the right places. And I suppose that horrible quote of time is money, I suppose it's somewhat true here. So, I will turn down clients because I've consulted them that they're looking for a unicorn, or they're asking for a Ferrari, but they have a budget for a Toyota, right?
Yeah.
So, eh, now if I'm saying no, as I said, when I speak to hundreds of candidates per week, then I would assume that the role is going to be next to impossible to fill or close to. Um, and going to a recruiter isn't necessarily going to fix the problem. It's just managing expectations. So, quite frankly, what a good recruiter and a good partner is going to do is have that conversation with you and be very upfront and honest about what that looks like. Um, and I've always said, Dimitri, that just in life, you should hold the people that are most honest with you the closest, even if you don't like what you're hearing.
That's great advice. I find often people do the opposite, which is frustrating.
Well, they'll probably tell you what you want to hear.
Yeah.
And I suppose you also have to consider that, when you're speaking to a less tenured recruiter, right, that there is something about somebody who's had those conversations with COOs, CEOs, CROs, heads of business development at these quant funds, portfolio managers, quant traders, so on. When you've had that conversation enough and you see the value that comes from managing expectations effectively, and look, there is a bit of an art to it, I suppose. You've got to do it the right way. It's not going into like a bull in a china shop and telling someone that they're wrong, right? It is a true consultative conversation that really gives them additional perspective. That is incredibly important. Otherwise, I know they're not going to get anywhere. And you can speak to as many recruiters as you want, and there'll be lots of recruiters that will probably take on that business. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'll give it a crack. But then they're spending hours of their time wasted, and also they're honestly sending candidates that are irrelevant as well because they're not going to find the right person. So you're wasting everybody's time.
Yeah, I think it's a challenging position, and I think a lot of these misconceptions I think come from the junior recruiters. To your point, like
Yeah,
that churn, right? And then we have these bad experiences where it's like people are taking on the roles, and it's like it'd be nice if someone would just be up front and say, "Hey, look, like this is not reasonable." Like I spent a
yeah,
lot of time reading all the reports, like the Selby Jennings reports on the salary comp,
sure.
because I have like these junior recruiters come in, they go, "Oh, we got an analyst, it'll be perfect for you," and I'm like, "All right, Send me the resume. They go, this guy wants 250,000. And I'm like, he's got a year of experience. What are you talking about? 250? Go, no. He worked for this really good fund. And I'm just like, come
And
on.
that's probably more of the, you know, trying to make a sale versus trying to build a relationship, right?
Yeah.
And look, that's part of the job, right? Is you know, when you mentioned earlier at the start of the podcast about, you know, spamming emails, um, you know, partly what recruiters do is they find a really good profile, a really good candidate within a specific market segment, and they're effectively prospecting that candidate out to generate interviews for the candidate, right? With clients that possibly you've never worked with before, you have no terms in place with, no agreement in place, but it's, you know, it generates business. But again, it's if you know your market well enough, you understand that a credit risk modeling manager, you're not going to pay them 250K on the base,
Hmm.
right? And so again, part of really sort of embedding yourself in the business is, you know, the way I think about my job when I'm engaging with clients is I don't want to be in competition with you or your internal talent team. I want to act as an extension of your business, right? Because actually, when you break it down, Dimitri, what we're doing is we're marketing your business. We're talking about your business, right? We're going to market. We're speaking to hundreds of candidates for potential roles, and it's incredibly important that you have a recruiter that is representing your business in the best way possible. Otherwise, that, you know, that reputational damage does happen when a less experienced or an average or poor recruiter is not, you know, I suppose communicating and landscaping and conveying the role and the client in the best light.
So is the best way to find a quality recruiter then to go off of experience? You know, you've been in the industry for 5 years. This is kind of maybe there's a breaking point of they've done this enough, they've gone through the motions, they're starting to really get down those skills.
Not necessarily, no. Um, what you tend to find, particularly with larger recruitment agencies, myself included, for the last 3 years before I started my own business, was most senior people, I say senior, you know, I suppose tenured individuals, tend to be in managerial leadership roles. So their role is not necessarily to sit there and find the candidates. Their role is more so to act as a key client point of contact, to big accounts or new accounts or accounts that, you know, you're trying to sort of turn from bad to good effectively. Um, you know, it's coaching the team, it's spending time with the team, it's you know, looking at the operational side of things and dealing with the ops side. So it's less so hands-on than it is, you know, say somebody with 2, 3, 4, even 1 year's worth of experience. So what you really want to do is find a good combination of both, right?
Mhm.
That you have a recruitment leader that you have as a point of contact, somebody who does have some experience, who's really going to understand what you're looking for, and they can actually translate that to the team. Because, you know, there are, I mean, countless examples of recruiters with 6 to 12 months experience who are absolutely brilliant at what they do. And they're absolutely brilliant in what they do in terms of finding the right profile, right? But they're not going to find the right profile with the right guidance, right? Without the right guidance. And so I think it's actually finding a combination of both, right? Um, you know, there are also recruiters, there's going to be, you know, instances where you have a more junior recruiter who, quite frankly, is incredibly talented. You know, they're an incredibly hard worker, they have a high aptitude, strong sort of IQ, EQ, particularly that EQ side, the emotional intelligence is incredibly important. We're in the people business after all. And, you know, they accelerate their careers very fast. And so what you'll see is on some LinkedIn profiles, somebody with 2 years experience, they're an SVP, right? And
Yeah.
if I'm honest with you, it's a little bit of Mickey Mouse titles, is what
Oh,
I call it.
I've known. I look at that, I'm like, this guy's not running a whole division. He's been here for a
I know.
year.
Exactly. So I think it's a combination of both, but there are, you know, always going to be recruiters out there who are very, very talented. But if you want to play it on the safe side, it's engaging with a leader, it's engaging with somebody who can act as that key client point of contact, who does really understand the market, the industry. After a year, you could be the best recruiter in the world, but if you don't really understand the intricacies and the nuances of that industry and your target market, then how much does that mean, right? So if you can find a combination of both, that's probably the safest bet.
Okay. That makes sense. And how would you go about helping clients write better job descriptions. I am awful. I am absolutely awful. I've written one, I think it was like 2 years ago. And then like HR looked at it and they're like, "Do you want someone that does credit modeling and has 5 years experience as a manager?" They're like, "What else do you need?" And I'm like, "I don't know, someone who's great." And I was like, "Here's a candidate." I give them like a profile. I'm like, "I want this guy, but I can't get him." And they're like, "That's not helpful."
No, I appreciate that. And I think honestly, that's why it is important to work with a good recruiter, right? I mean, when I think of a job description, I think of it almost the same way as a resume, right? It's your opportunity to sell
Mhm.
without necessarily having a conversation, right? So a client is going to have a set of requirements. There will often be hard requirements and there's going to be soft requirements. What most candidates don't understand is many hiring managers are open to finding candidates that are an 80% fit, i.e., they have most of the experience, but not all of the experience. The reason this makes for an attractive hire, and you'll see where I'm going with this, is often candidates who are like for like and have the perfect profile and are doing the role that you know, a competitor, um, is they're typically, I would say often, not all the time, so I don't want to sort of, paint everyone with the same brush here, but they're typically moving just for money, right? If
Mhm.
they're doing the same role, you're going to be doing the same role moving, right? It's a lateral move, but just, you're going upwards on the base. And if that is the main motivation, you can reasonably assume that 12 months down the line of post that person starting, after they join, they may want to make a jump to increase compensation once again.
Yeah.
So those who are an 80% fit, they're actually able to step into a role and actually go through a learning experience, right? Knowledge acquisition is actually, there's been loads of studies on this. It's obviously anecdotal from my own experiences as well. Knowledge acquisition is a really key component to retention,
Mhm.
right? If people feel they're learning and they're acquiring a new skill set and such, they're going to stay longer, and they're just more stimulated in that role. They see more value coming from their employer as there's obviously additional personal professional development. And so I think there's an element with the job description of really defining what you're looking for. What are the hard requirements and what are the softer requirements? And do you actually put that on the job description? Because what a lot of hiring managers do is it's very descriptive, it's very objective, and there's no personality to those, right?
Yeah.
There's no personality. And so I think if that's definitely part of it. The challenge many firms have, particularly now post mass layoffs, from 2023 and early this year, is there's lots and lots of candidates on the market. And what they're going to do is they're going to apply for as many roles as possible. And you said it yourself, you're getting McDonald's workers, you're getting janitors, right?
Yep.
Whatever. Um, uh, and I often see LinkedIn posts telling job searchers to spam their resumes via the easy apply option and saying that's a good idea. I post a role, and quite frankly, Dimitri, 90% of applicants are completely irrelevant,
Oh yeah.
right? And there's those who apply more than once as well with a
Yep.
different email address, and that puts me off speaking to them altogether.
I don't think people realize that. Like even in our HR form, it will pull them and say, we've had people apply it twice, same email address, same name, same resume. And yeah, to your point, I see it and I'm like, nope, like you're
No,
just spamming because you forgot you applied to it.
exactly, right? Exactly. And so, it's when I assess candidates, I'm really trying to leave no stone left unturned. Remember, I'm more likely to advocate for you if you can communicate your motivations, your passion, your excitement for a role. Because when I submit a candidate, they are in many respects a reflection of me and my business. If I
Mhm.
send really poor candidates to do a terrible job in interview, you're probably going to think, Zach's probably not the best. He sent me a couple of rubbish candidates, didn't work out. I spent 2, 3 hours interviewing 2, 3 candidates. That's not the direction I want to go in. But when it comes to job postings, I'd say 85 to 90% of job postings are very bland and boring
Mhm.
without any mention of the value prop. What is your value proposition for working at a firm? Now, a good recruiter, when you're on an intake call or you have a role, you go externally, you have your 1 or 3 recruitment firms that you want to work with. What a good recruiter is going to ask is, tell me about your value proposition, because I'm going after passive candidates. I'm going after candidates who aren't necessarily looking for a role. And therefore, I need to really understand, what's the sell here, right? And so 9 out of 10 times, Dimitri, a hiring manager will do a fantastic job of telling me what the sell is. and to the point that I want to apply. I'm like, that's brilliant. That's exciting. And that's what gets me going to, want to work for my clients. But then they don't put that on the job description. There's no sell. It's just, we're looking for X, Y, and Z, here's the role.
Yeah.
And then maybe a bit of a sell on, oh, we're a growing company. Well, who isn't?
Yeah.
Right. So the top 10% of candidates, they're not going to apply for a role to a badly worded, poorly constructed, and run-of-the-mill job posting. And I always say, as a general rule of thumb in life, and particularly recruitment, the standard you set is the standard you get.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes both ways, right? For candidates too, in their resumes and how they're presenting themselves on that piece of paper. But the same goes for the client and your job posting.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely my weakest point, and I am super, super picky. So I'd probably make an awful candidate for a recruiter as the hiring manager, because I've had a job opening, I think open for close to 2 years. It's been unofficially there, and it comes up and it goes away. And to
Yeah.
your point, it costs us a lot of time and headaches and money. But at the same time, I'm so picky on cultural fit.
Mm.
And for some reason, I have a hard time assessing it. But then at the same time, I can read quant resumes and I can weed out like fake resumes very quickly. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of candidates, it's like, oh, I've built these models, I've done this. And then I'll do the interview. And when I start asking, like, what was the hardest part of that problem, like that project you
Mm.
worked on, it's very quickly, it's like candidates say, oh, like it was something simple and we solved it doing this. And I'm just scratching my head like, no.
Well, there's what you'll find is there's lots of candidates who, there's a whole sort of debate, particularly with automation, AI, ML, and screening and such of keywords, right? And
Yeah.
so lots of candidates will have the right keywords, right, on their resume, but when you ask them and you dig deeper, it's not it, right? They're not really doing that. Often it's you've got to look at the resume, and this is where AI and ML has a harder time
Yeah.
of when you look at the resume, there's going to be keywords on there, but the keywords start with coordinate or facilitate, right?
Yeah.
Versus, actually doing the
Yeah.
job, right? And so I think that's where a good recruiter who understands and can read a resume is going to save so much more time. But again, it comes back to that point of I think a lot of hiring managers, the feedback I give is they need to look inward, right, about how realistic is what they're looking for. They need to sort of, I suppose, self-regulate that a little bit. Again, when you speak to a recruiter or you're struggling to fill a role and it's been X amount of months or years, that's at that point you should probably look inward and say, okay, well, what's the likelihood of me filling this role? And maybe I should speak to a recruiter in this space to ask me sorry, give the feedback and bounce some ideas off of them and ask them, like, is this likely? Can I get this filled at the price point and what I'm looking for? Are there actually people out there that are doing X, Y, and Z within my bandings and such? So yeah, I think it's it's an interesting conversation for sure.
I think it's hard though to find good candidates, in the sense that, like, I know like the person I want, like I already know the person is, and we're
Mm,
good personal friends. But I think it's hard to find great candidates because great candidates tend to stick at one firm. It's like they've been there 10 years, 15, like they're happy, they're being compensated well. I know they are. I know they're great talents. Why the firm's kept them for so long and why they've chosen to stay.
yeah.
I think that's for me. After all these struggles of trying to hire this person, I know like that's the hard piece, is finding that person that's not jumping. Because I'm getting applications, right? And it's every year to 2 years. I look at the resume every year to 2 years, they're jumping. And to
Yeah.
your point, right? They're chasing the dollar. They're not really looking at a good cultural fit, a
Mm,
long-term relationship. But I do think it's challenging to find kind of those applicants. And to your point, right, AI is not going to do.
no.
AI is not going to know.
And actually for that that segment of candidate, that level of candidate, who are, if you've been somewhere for 10 years and you're earning good money within that role, it's safe to say and reasonable to assume they're pretty damn good at their job,
Yeah.
right? And so prying them away is a task in and of itself, right? And that's where, it is incredibly important. And I sort of talk from a search agency perspective of, again, working with the right people. And that's really when, we call recruitment, it sits under the sales banner, right? I suppose. I don't like that, but it's true. but that's where, selling is so powerful, right? It's helping people realize and understand the potential future value of moving, right? And also maybe helping them understand that where they're at might not be the best place, right?
Hmm.
And until you have that conversation, until you actually explore that with a good recruiter, then, who's not pushy, who's not trying to have you move for the sake of moving, because actually there's candidates I've known for years who, you know, never moved, and then one day they reach out and say, Zach, I'm ready. Right. So if you
Yeah.
have that relationship, they're an incredible candidate, but it could be the smallest thing, right? And then I would look at that and really sort of try and dig deeper into that, really sort of lift the hood on, you know, what could be better. And I think that's where perspective is everything. And again, a good recruiter is going to create that perspective where maybe the candidate doesn't see that perspective. Maybe their family doesn't see that perspective, right? So I think you're right, and it is tough, but that's where true headhunting, i.e., approaching passive or inactive talent,
Hmm.
is such a skill, versus just posting a job ad and getting people apply. And because really those candidates are going to have multiple interviews. You're going to be competing potentially with multiple offers when you're just working with a passive candidate, right? And I introduce them to you. You're the only sort of voice in their ear,
Yeah.
right? It makes life a little bit easier.
Yeah, definitely. It's for me, that's been like the big value add for a recruiter are the ones that stick around for those long-term relationships. Because to your
Mm,
point, I've had firms where it's like senior management changed and it was great for 7, 8 years. And then to your point, right, it's just now's the time. And having that long-term relationship makes that process, I think, a lot easier on the candidate as well, because you feel like, okay, you know, they've been following up with me, they've stuck around for years, and now is kind of the time to kind of take the benefits kind of that relationship.
absolutely, absolutely agreed.
So how are you guys coping with remote too? Because to this point, right, it's hard for me. I've had job offer after job offer, both in academia and the industry, and I keep telling people like I don't want to move.
Mm,
But the remote thing has been so big, but we do see now everyone seems to be shifting back to in office. And even when
yep.
we get people apply, I mean, I work remote 4 days a week, and I'm in the office one day. Even for me, it's like I want candidates in office so that we can build the team, we can
Mm,
work together, especially when you're training and adapting. And it seems like now everyone's like, yeah, I'll take the job if it's remote. And that
yeah.
seems like a hard sale, I think, for a company and a candidate as well to put all that together.
Yeah, and I think part of it is a bit of a handshake across firms to say, look, we're all in it together, we're all going back into office, right? Because then, you ultimately monopolize the market in a certain way, and a candidate's not going to see anything different within that, I say financial services or, big tech, whatever. But no, I think that in realistically speaking, it is a tough one because obviously with COVID, people took the opportunity to move away from high cost locations, but also maintain the same compensation package, right? And so they were working out of Texas, but were initially based in San Francisco. And then a year or two, even now it's happening, clients are saying, well, you have to come back to office, right? So the good news about that is there's actually really good candidates on the market because they just don't want to
Yeah.
leave Texas, for example. Um, I think there is it's really it's a game of tennis right now, it feels, because one minute it's fully remote and these companies are huge advocates of the flexibility, and they realize that that 2 hour 1 hour commute in the morning could be better spent at your laptop in the morning being productive. And then there's other clients who really put focus and value on corporate culture. But also, if we're really honest with ourselves, there's big real estate costs, right? There's commercial real estate there that take Goldman, they're building this 5,000 person office in downtown Dallas. They have to fit it, right? I went on site with Exxon in the Woodlands in Houston a couple of years ago now, and they have this incredible campus. I mean, it's huge. It's I think 10, 15,000 person campus. I mean, there's a
Wow.
CVS on site. There's a doctor on site. I think it was crazy. Um, and the client point of contact I was speaking to, I said, have you filled all this space? I mean, it seems a little bit empty for the size of it. And he said, no, I mean, we're actually leasing out office space to other companies, to other businesses, because we can't fill it. Um, and then a couple of months after that, they announced an entire restructuring and the hiring of 5,000 people that they wanted to get on board, right, across certain segments of their business because they needed to get bums on seats, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I think there's, generally speaking, a hybrid setup of 3 and 2 is the most common you're going to see right now. Um, there are firms that are just have a hard line on being fully in office. Typically, actually, or interestingly, a lot of smaller firms tend to be less flexible, which you
Mhm.
might not think would be the case because they do value that corporate culture because one person ultimately has a lot more influence on the wider organization because they are dipping their toes in lots of different puddles and facing off to different stakeholders, and therefore that interaction day on day is incredibly important to build culture versus bigger firms, which, I mean, look, Salesforce, right? I have a friend who works at Salesforce. They are saying you have to be in office, you have to scan your badge. I know people that are still working and living, all over the US that should be in office.
Yeah.
So they're not really, there's no real consequence, right? It's not weighted. There's no weighted consequence to that. So I think, look, I think ultimately, in short, sort of summarize the point, it's going to be interesting to see how remote work evolves. I do believe that you have a hiring edge if you have, more remote days than in an
Mhm.
office. That's just standard. Interestingly, in recruitment, I would say that, although I'm a big advocate, particularly in sales, to be in office and have that sort of that buzz and that vibe around the office and such and that interaction, again, there's a reality that a lot of recruiters want to be remote and they're going to be more attracted and probably consider less salary to be remote and have that flexibility.
Yeah, that's been my big hurdle is I'm at the small startup. I have the ability to work from home 4 days a week. And so when
Yeah.
people say, why don't you go work for this company? You had a great offer. And I'm like, I'd have to go back in the office and I have
It's
to
what you value
commute.
more, right? If it's money, if it's flexibility, and people just value different things, and it's so important to really understand that, right? So to your point, right, if you're 4 days work from home, an extra 20K is just not worth it because maybe
Yeah.
you're spending close to that in cost for the car, for gas, for insurance, for everything else, right? You family, children, right? There's often things you have to sacrifice to make that work.
Yeah, definitely. So to wrap this podcast up here, do you want to give us any advice or tips for those that are job seeking or for corporations that are hiring recruiters, things that you think would be helpful to know to kind of make the interaction a little better?
I think it's probably more sort of in terms of how people are finding jobs, right? How to get their foot in the door. Um, is probably, I think, more relevant because I think, it's depending on the market segment, it's going to be very candidate driven or very client or job driven, essentially. The quant market specifically on quantitative finance is just one of the most, it's obviously one of the most stimulating, glamorous fields around. Aside from research labs at fan companies, there are very few jobs where you get to do academic-esque research and get paid a ton to do it, right?
Yeah.
Not to mention the field is full of really fascinating computational problems, and you get access to incredible data sets and computational tools. So, working alongside and this is really where the demand is you're working with brilliant and incredible people. Some of the best parts of the industry are the incredible conversations you have with colleagues, right? Which is probably an advocate, particularly in the quant finance world of being an office. And
Yeah.
so really you're attracting, really interesting high level people. Um, and sort of waking up every day and you're learning and applying, I suppose, graduate level mathematics and computer science. What more could you want? And it is really highly competitive. Maybe not as brutal as some people make it out to be. I had a conversation with a student who spent the last 3 years trying to get into it. And I asked them, have you ever considered that if it's taken you 3 years to try and get there at the expense of everything else in your life, that perhaps maybe you're not cut out for it? That's not to say you're not smart, but quant finance usually uses people with a more theoretical background, where many other STEM jobs usually hire someone with a practical background. So interview questions tend to be focused on that side of things. They did a degree in comp sci engineering where you learn the theoretical part, but you're applying it to certain things. Perhaps their skills lean more that way. So I think, there is also a conversation around, and and this probably goes both sides of certain people, are they aiming too high, right?
Hmm.
I.e., you have a master's degree in statistics from a non-Ivy League university. Should you be applying for D shore or 2 SIG? If you have a GPA that is below a 3.5, but you did graduate from an Ivy League university, the same question applies. And so you take Citadel, for example, they won't consider a candidate with less than a 3.5 GPA. It's almost unrealistic. Uh, well, it's almost an automatic no, right? Thanks, but
Yeah.
no thanks. So I always suggest first to set your expectations really, like, just set your expectations. Don't shoot for the moon if the moon is just too far out of reach. Getting your foot in the door at a tier two shop or even an investment bank where it's slightly easier to get into might be the best play. Companies like Jump Trading, they're more focused on the programming and software development side before transitioning somebody to actual strategies and taking on risk. So one piece of advice I would say as well, just particularly because I know a lot of your following is students, is the stat arb track at investment banks is good because they're smaller teams that do everything, as opposed to nowadays, if at a, like, I don't know, 2 SIG or Square Point, you only see small pieces of the pie. Um, I think there's a final couple of points. Maximizing your skill set is important, right? Firms look for outstanding, standout candidates. So ask yourself, what are you and your profile, or what is it about you and your profile that makes you remotely different, right? If the answer is nothing, then you're going to have a hard time, right? So, it's making sure there are extracurricular activities, research projects, competitions that you've undergone to put in your profile, so that when a recruiter is reviewing a resume, they see a wolf, not a sheep. So I think it's obviously a longer conversation, and actually, quite frankly, could be a podcast in itself. But I would say you have to take a very proactive approach, in terms of outreach and consistency of your outreach. Um, you've got to be very good at certain things, mental math and coding. Some
Hmm.
firms obviously have a coding part to interviews. But in most cases you don't need much coding skills. If you're applying a more algo focused, or applying to, I suppose, a more algo focused shop, you should be prepared to answer algorithmic questions. For those who have a lot of CS knowledge, computer science, I wouldn't focus on these types of firms if you have a strong computer science background. So it's fairly self-explanatory, but I think people miss, and they sort of have more of a scattergun approach to trying to find a job. There's actually some really good tools that people can use. One is called Rank Your Brain, which is really good from on the math side and algebra side. There's lots of resources to practice sort of probability questions too. There's a really good book by I think his name is Mark Joshi. I'm not sure how to
Uh-huh.
pronounce it.
Yeah.
Which is Quant Job Interview. Don't know if
Uh-huh.
you're familiar with that.
Yeah, I know
Yeah.
exactly the bug.
Okay, that's a good one. And so on. So, I think the other point there as well is reaching out to alumnus of your school who are currently at or worked at a bank or a hedge fund in which you're interested in working at, because preferably as somebody who's obviously in a quantitative role. And if you share a common university connection, that's great. But also, there's resources like Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, maybe contacting someone who was quoted in an article, or in a magazine, right? Like there's Institutional Investor, or Absolute Return Plus Alpha. Most people will be actually quite flattered that you notice them in the press, and they'll respond. So yeah, I think there's a lot there, but I think from a quant perspective, there's obviously lots of things that a hiring manager can do better, particularly around really defining the USP. You don't need to do that if you're at a D Shore or Citadel, or wherever, right, at a big quant shop, because the name in and of itself is enough to sell, and you get thousands of applicants the same way as a Google and a
Hmm.
Meta. But I think for those clients out there that where there is a war for talent, particularly on the quant market, um, or sorry, I suppose the war for talent within sort of fintechs and lesser known firms, there's lots of things you can do to make sure that you're really representing your business and selling the role effectively, and really defining what is that unique selling point for us as a business.
Awesome. That's great advice. Thanks for
Cool.
coming on, Zach.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate it. It was great. And as I said, I mean, there's tons to talk about, particularly in relation to the quant market, and the nuance and intricacies. And obviously, I know you have a great following, and a fantastic network yourself. So if anyone's listening and wants to get a bit more insight and understand those nuances and intricacies and so on, I'm more than happy to connect on that.